Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a cold night like tonight. Nice to see a good turnout. Thank you. I think you're going to enjoy tonight's lots of stories. So welcome to this evening's talk on the history of the East Perth Cemeteries. I'm going to share with you a historical overview, stories of some early Perth colonists, tales of convicts and guards and others, and the possible experience of ghosts. So here we go, a trip back to 1829. The East Perth Cemeteries were established on Wajak Noongar lands when the British Swan River Colony was founded in 1829. The site, called Cemetery Hill, was surveyed by John Septimus Roe. It is estimated 10,000 people were buried here in a 90-year period to 1919. There are 8 sections, which is why the place is now known as East Perth Cemeteries. It is estimated there are about 4,500 original grave sites. Today, only 804 grave sites have been identified. In the early days, burials were restricted to times as soon after sunrise as possible, or an hour precisely before sunset. The graves face east, as it was the Christian belief that if the deceased were buried to face east, they could rise again on the day of resurrection. Many of the early burial services were performed by the colonial chaplain John Whitenoom, after whom a street was named that today borders the cemetery within which he found his final resting place in 1855, aged 66. Interesting to discover, his granddaughter Edith Cowan now has a university named after her and features on our $50 note. In 1842, the first to be allocated land in the cemetery were the Anglicans. Then in later years, the Congregational, Wesleyan, Roman Catholic, Jewish and Presbyterian. In 1867, a section was created for the felons and the so-called promiscuous. In the middle of the burial grounds in 1848, St Bartholomew's was built as a small mortuary chapel, which became a parish church in 1888. After extensions in 1900 and restoration in 1976, it still stands today and is used for weddings and other services. By the late 1800s, the predominantly male Chinese community in WA numbered around 1,600. Less than 1% of the state's population. Many worked in gardening, furniture factories, laundries, bakeries or in domestic service. Many Christians refused to allow Chinese to be buried in consecrated land, and others stipulated that they buried in fenced-off areas. In response, from 1888, on the western side of Plain Street, a separate unconsecrated section, lot E69, was gazetted for Chinese burials. In 1994, on the eastern side of Plain Street, a memorial was erected in the East Perth Cemeteries by the Chung Wah Association to commemorate Chinese who worked and died in Western Australia. While the East Perth Cemetery's land was more than 20% larger than the 12.5 acres it is today, it was too small for a growing colony. For populations around Fremantle, there was first a small cemetery at Alma Street, a second cemetery at Skinner Street, then the third currently active Fremantle Cemetery of 110 acres was established in 1898. In 1899, with the increased population from the gold boom, Karrakatta Cemetery, much larger at 243 acres, became the main burial ground close to Perth, and from that year, burials officially ceased at East Perth. With special applications, the East Perth cemeteries were used intermittently from 1899 until the last burial in 1919. From 1957, administration of the East Perth cemeteries was vested in the National Parks Board. Then from 1985 with the Department of Conservation and Land Management. And from 1994 with the National Trust of Western Australia, who manage it today. With burials ceasing at the East Perth cemeteries, over the years there has been scavenging, mindless vandalism and natural decay of stonework. Jarrah headboards, widely used as gravesite markers, disappeared long ago. By 1925, its ruinous and abandoned condition had become a public scandal. By 1934, the entire East Perth Cemetery site was declared a disused burial ground and revested as a Class A Crown Reserve. From the late 1940s, cemetery monuments in the lots west of Plain Street were bulldozed, carted away and mostly dumped. Many records were irretrievably lost. The Presbyterian and Chinese cemeteries on the western lots between Bronte and Wickham Streets were relinquished and the land made available to the Education Department. From the 1950s, the Perth Girls' School were using the site as tennis courts. Later it became a car park. Responding to plans for redevelopment in 2020, after 11 months of painstaking work by a team of 30 archaeologists and forensic anthropologists, 461 individuals were exhumed, taken to Karrakatta Cemetery and reinterred in ossuary containers in an area called the East Perth Cemetery's Memorial Garden. With the old graveyard cleared, plans for a $400 million development were approved in June 2022 to include a multi-tower development. On the western side of Plain Street, north of Wickham Street, was Lot E72, which comprised the Jewish cemetery, dating from 1867. Today, the site is now mostly housing, where all that remains is a small memorial area with a list of 32 known burials, mostly in the 1890s, and 8 restored headstones which were relocated from the eastern side of Plain Street. Of the 32 listed Jewish burials, 16 are for infants, many of whom were victims of the 1890s typhoid epidemic. Here are a graph of deaths at the East Perth cemeteries from 1830 to 1920. Deaths peaked in the mid-1890s due to the typhoid epidemic. Most deaths occurred on the goldfields where, for this waterborne disease, there was poor sanitation and overcrowding. Nearly 2,000 people in WA were officially recorded as dying of the disease, though the actual number is understood to be far greater. Here another graph of deaths, this by age groups. The vertical axis shows both number of persons who died and percentages of the total. Most noticeable are the deaths younger than 1 year old and deaths younger than 5 years old, which combined are about 19% of the total deaths in the 90-year period. Many were stillborn or succumbed to complications from lack of hygiene and medical support, which we often take for granted these days. Here a map of the East Perth Cemetery's grave sites, being from a 3-year project documenting the cemeteries, resulting in a very comprehensive 3-volume book written in 1986 by James Richardson and David Davies, available at the Batty Library. I've enhanced the map to show the boundaries for the religious denominations and other groups which have been accentuated and highlighted in colour. The bottom right, the Anglicans are coloured in pink, have the largest area. The top right is the next largest area, being for the Roman Catholics, coloured green. The map has been extended to show the original cemetery lots both east and west of Plain Street. In the early years, Wickham Street, which just came in from the left, and Horatio Street, from down the bottom in the middle, once extended into the eastern cemeteries area, but were then closed to be known as Lot 830. In the book by Richardson and Davies is this table showing number of grave sites identified. In the cemeteries east of Plain Street, in total there are 804 identified grave sites, of which 780 have monuments. The number of grave sites west of Plain Street are not known, as the lots have been bulldozed and the areas resumed for urban development. As to the names on surviving monuments, there were counted a total of 1,655 names. 54.4% are Anglican, 17.9% are Roman Catholic, 10.8% Presbyterian, 10.6% Wesleyan, 5.9% Independent or Congregational, and less than 1% are Jewish. Here the family tree of John Septimus Roe and his wife Matilda. John and Matilda, together with Captain James Stirling, were on the Parmelia, the first British ship to arrive in Fremantle on the 1st of June 1829. John and Matilda were to have 14 children and at least 72 grandchildren. Both, with other family members, are buried in grave 420 in the Anglican section. There is also a family grave in grave 440. The grave inscription for Matilda Rowe is extensive and heartfelt, referring to a most devoted and affectionate wife, mother and friend. It also says, "Her last sigh is breathed, the last tear is given. She hath gone from this home to a better in heaven. Oh, grieve not for her, for the spirit hath gone, where sorrow and care and grief are unknown. And great joy is hers, for with songs of sweet love she hath joined her bright sister angels above." By 1829, John Septimus Roe left his 16 years in the Royal Navy to accept a civilian appointment and become the first Surveyor General of WA. Roe's initial responsibilities included planning the layout of Fremantle and Perth. The demands on Roe were great, as within the first 12 months, 38 ships had arrived in Fremantle. As shown on the slide, based on Roe's survey data, this is a map showing the original 1829 land grants to many of the early settlers who were able to take advantage of river frontages. John Septimus Roe became a renowned explorer, conducting numerous expeditions between 1829 and 1849, when he mapped much of our state. He led a distinguished life, being a member of WA's Legislative and Executive Councils for nearly 40 years. Since 1990, a statue of him stands in the city at the crooked junction of St George's Terrace and Adelaide Terrace. It is said that the reason for the kink in the road is because of Matilda Roe's garden, which extended there beyond the footpath. Matilda Roe is also today remembered in the naming of Matilda Bay. Roe's death in 1878 was marked with a public funeral with full military honours, said to be the most impressive ever seen to that time in the colony. The legacy of John Septimus Roe is today remembered in numerous places. One of his most significant contributions was setting aside Kings Park, being gazetted for public use in 1870. Places named in his honour include Roeburn, the first town in the north of WA, Roe Highway in Perth, and Roe Street in Northbridge. Also named after Roe is the southern WA electoral district of Roe, the John Septimus Roe Anglican Community School in Mirrabooka, as well as an abalone, Haliotis roei, and a species of orchid named Calladania roei. Here the family tree of Edward Hugh Barron and his wife Jane. The Barrons had 11 children, of which 8 were born in Perth. They had at least 47 grandchildren. Both Edward and Jane, with 2 of their infant grandsons, are buried in Roman Catholic grave 96. In 1829, on the 8th of June, Edward and Jane, with 3 children, arrived in Fremantle on the Sulphur, being the second passenger ship to arrive in the colony. It is said Jane was the first white woman to step on the shores of WA. Their 4th child, Edward George, born in August 1829, was one of the first Europeans to be born here. Edward Barron was a sergeant in the 63rd Regiment, which was sent out with the first settlers for their protection. In 1834, Edward was wounded by Aboriginals and at age 39 was discharged from the army, thereafter understood to assist with his wife's business. Jane Barron became an innkeeper and was evidently entrepreneurial. Here are extracts from the Perth Gazette in 1833 showing she was the licensee of the Wheat Sheaf Tavern at 1 Murray Street on the corner of Barrack Street. As the ad says, Jane continues her dairy, has commenced baking and will supply her customers with the best bread on the most reasonable terms. Jane was the first woman in the colony to possess a cow. Much has changed since then. Here the family tree of John Henry Munger and his wife Mary. I say hello to the Munger relatives in the audience tonight who I know are here. In October 1829, they arrived in Fremantle on the ship Lotus. They had 7 children and would have at least 45 grandchildren. Mary died in 1864, aged 61, followed by John Henry, who died 1867, aged 65. Initially, both were buried in grave 72 in the Wesleyan section. Later, with the family wealth having grown, they were moved to join 6 other family members at the most impressive memorial in the East Perth Cemeteries, being at gravesite 283, with the magnificent tall white angel and crypt underneath. John Henry Munger, an engineer by trade, constructed and managed a sawmill by a lake, today known as Lake Munger. In 1833, because of problems with local Aborigines, the business at the lake was moved to Mount Street. In 1836, the family left Perth and relocated to York, where he built his home called Faversham House, named after Faversham in England, where John Henry was born. After opening a general store, his business dealings diversified, including wool, fencing wire and sandalwood, which boomed from the 1840s to 1880s. Munger built the York Hotel, the first flour mill in York, and paid for the town's first bridge. John Henry Munger became one of the richest men in the Perth colony. Today, the Munger name is remembered not only at Lake Munger, but also Munger Street in Perth. There are also Munger Streets in Bencubbin, Beverley, Brookton, Pingelly and York. I hear Faversham House in York is currently up for sale. Offers are from $2.5 million, which will give you 15 stately bedrooms, 13 bathrooms, a formal dining hall to seat 20 guests, an opulent ballroom, a library and a wine cellar. I believe offers close 25th of August, for those who are interested. Here the family tree of Henry Trigg and his wife Amelia, married in Kent in 1813. They had 10 children and at least 30 grandchildren. In October 1829, Henry arrived in Fremantle with 3 of his daughters aboard the Lotus, the same ship as the Mungers. 2 years later, in 1831, Amelia arrived aboard the ship called Egyptian with the other children. Three children were then born in Perth. In 1873, Amelia passed away aged 82, followed by Henry, who died in 1882, aged 90. Henry and Amelia and 3 family members are buried in grave 29 in the congregational section of the East Perth Cemeteries. At grave 492 is Henry and Amelia's son William, with 4 family members. The headstone includes what I find an amusing inscription. It says, down the bottom, "Reader, ponder and prepare thyself to follow." Henry Trigg was to be remembered for his substantial contributions to public works in and around Perth. After initially being appointed head constable for Perth, he found scope for the exercise of his trade as house carpenter and builder. Being recognised as an upright and industrious tradesman for 12 years from 1839 to 1851, he served as superintendent of public works. In his role, Henry supervised the construction of Perth Causeway, which opened in 1843, and the Canning Bridge, constructed in 1849. Henry designed the first lighthouse on Rottnest Island. He also supervised the building of St George's Anglican Church, the precursor to St George's Cathedral. Henry Trigg had firm Christian beliefs. He told the story of an incident in 1831 when he was recovering from a bout of rum drinking. An apparition appeared to him and commanded him to throw down the bottle and never pick it up again. From that moment on, he was a changed man. Henry founded the Congregational Church in Perth. In 1846, a chapel was constructed in William Street, where for 6 years Trigg conducted all the services until 1852. When Henry Trigg passed away, his 90-year life was seen as a blessing to many, with the name revered as that of a good man. The legacy of Henry Trigg is today remembered in the naming of the northern suburb of Perth called Trigg, which was established in the 1940s. Highlight of the suburb is the magnificent coastline featuring Trigg Beach. Hear the familiar story of Joseph Hardy, who in 1830 arrived in Fremantle on the chartered ship Tranby. Joseph was spiritual leader of 35 passengers, all Methodists, including his older brother John and their wives Anne and Elizabeth. On the mainland peninsula, the Tranby immigrants were granted 512 acres. Joseph's first 2 houses were destroyed by flood. His third house, constructed on higher ground and using bricks from local clay, still stands today as Tranby House. On the peninsula, the Methodist farmers worked in a communal fashion to establish and support each other. Agricultural activities included raising cattle and sheep and sowing vegetables and cereal crops. Also, there was cultivation of a vineyard, wines from which in 1878 were the first from WA to win a gold medal in Paris. The Hardy brothers, Joseph and John, became well known as lay preachers. They helped build the first Methodist chapel where the present Wesley Church stands in William Street in the city. In 1860, they helped build the Wesleyan Chapel in South Perth. Sarah, one of Joseph's daughters, played a role in establishing Wesley College in South Perth. Sarah's family donated the bell from the Tranby ship to Wesley College, used to start the classes and to be rung by students on their first and last day at the college. Hear the family tree of Joseph Hardy and his wife Anne. They had 7 children, all born in Perth, 6 of which were daughters who in turn had no children. Family legend has it that Joseph insisted that none of his daughters was allowed to marry unless she married a minister of the Methodist Church. As there was only one minister in the colony, all but one remained single, being Mary Jane, who married the Reverend William Lowe. Joseph Hardy was appointed Commissioner and Guardian to immigrant minors, a member of the Central Board of Works and of the Central Board of Education. Joseph's courage in the adversities of early settlement and his sympathetic service in visiting the sick, irrespective of their creed, won him admiration. Both Joseph and Anne and 7 other family members are buried in grave 71 in the Wesleyan section of the East Perth Cemeteries. Hear the family tree of Joseph's brother John Wall Hardy and his wife Elizabeth. They had 8 children born in WA and at least 20 grandchildren. John Wall Hardy participated in an early expedition over the Darling Ranges, which opened up the fertile Avon Valley, where he and his brother Joseph would acquire over 16,000 acres of land where they grazed sheep and cattle. John was exceptionally active in civic affairs, including being president of the Agricultural Society of WA, a JP, a magistrate, and active in the formation of the WA Chamber of Commerce. As chairman of the General Roads Trust, he exerted his influence and energy to see completion of the first causeway across the Swan River, which he opened in 1843. Both John and Elizabeth and 3 other family members are buried in grave 85 near the other Hardy grave in the Wesleyan section. The Hardy River in the Pilbara was named after John. The Hardy families are recognised in the naming of Hardy Road on the Maylands Peninsula and Hardy Road in Belmont, as well as Hardy Park in Ascot. In 1830, 9-year-old Walter Pabry, together with his father Thomas, arrived in Fremantle aboard the ship Protector. Thomas had been commissioned by Governor Stirling to care for a valuable consignment of 20 cattle, 85 merino sheep and 1 horse, for delivery to Peppermint Grove. Shortly after, Thomas tragically died of pneumonia. Walter had been left in the care of a couple who had travelled out on the same ship, but they stole the money Walter's father had left and abandoned him. Young Walter had to fend for himself. He worked as a carpenter's assistant in a hotel, as a shepherd, a drover, a fencing contractor and a stock agent. In 1844, 24-year-old Walter married Charlotte Nairn, aged 18. They were to have only one child, a daughter, who died shortly after birth. The year after his marriage, in 1845, Walter opened a butcher shop in Perth. In 1849, Walter fulfilled his father's dream by bringing his mother and siblings to WA. By 1855, Walter was able to purchase several properties which pioneered the breeding of cattle and sheep. In 1864, Walter was elected to the Perth City Council and represented the Swan River District in the Legislative Council. He built a general store in Guildford, becoming president of the Agricultural Society and chairman of the Guildford Municipal Council. In 1893, Walter and Charlotte built their home called Garden Hill in Meadow Street, overlooking the Swan River in Guildford. By the end of his life, Walter became one of the richest men in the Perth colony. With no heirs, Walter's vast fortune was left to relations, friends, several churches and charities. Walter died in 1907, aged 86. Together with Charlotte and 5 other relatives, they are buried in grave 512 in the Anglican section. In 1971, in recognition of his significant contributions to WA, the northern Perth suburb of Pabry was named after Walter Pabry. In 1990, a plaque was unveiled in Forest Place to recognise the naming of Pabry Walk, beside the site of the Pabry buildings, which were operated by the Pabry family from 1925 to 1985, before being demolished in 1987 to make way for the Myer building. Walter Pabry's legacy is still remembered in Guildford and Bassendean, where the Pabry store buildings still stand bearing his name. Here grave 435 for William Leader, his wife Hannah and their infant granddaughter. In 1830, William and Hannah and their 5 children arrived in Fremantle aboard the ship Rockingham. William was granted parcels of land around Lake Munga. William worked as a shoemaker, a merchant and a publican. He also took up land around Northam and started sheep farming. From 1831, William purchased the King's Head Hotel, which was redeveloped as the Leaders Hotel on the corner of St George's Terrace and William Street. Half a century after William's death in 1844, in 1897 the 3-storey Palace Hotel was built on the site and operated as licensed premises until 1981. In 2000 the building was included on the WA Heritage Register. Here a very interesting rare map of what was called Nouveau or New Subiaco. Today the location of 9 suburbs around Herdsman Lake and Lake Munga. The map is dated in the 1850s, shows various land holdings, including those of John Septimus Rowe, Henry Trigg, John Munga and William Leader, after whom Leaderville was named. Here the family tree of George Shenton and his wife Annie, who migrated to Perth, where they married in 1837. They had 13 children and at least 43 grandchildren. George drowned off Mandurah in 1867, aged 56, and is buried with Annie and 6 other family members in grave 83 in the Wesleyan section. In 1833, George Shenton arrived in Fremantle aboard the Cygnet, then became involved in the running of the mill at Point Belchers in South Perth, built by his cousin William Curnow Shenton. By 1838, George Shenton opened for business as Perth's first chemist. In 1841, he became a director of the Western Australian Bank. He also became involved in the export of jarrah and sandalwood, as well as various mining ventures. His eldest son, George, with interest in shipping and mining, became one of the most prominent merchants in WA. In 1880, George Shenton Jr. became first Mayor of Perth and was a long-serving chairman of directors of the Western Australian Bank. He's remembered in the naming of Perth's suburb of Shenton Park. Another prominent son was 13th child Ernest Shauna Shenton, who took over his father's firm, which included big trade in wool and sandalwood. In 1897, Ernest built a magnificent 30-room mansion on the South Perth Esplanade. Alas, the old grand house was demolished in 1976. Here in the Roman Catholic section, a grave for 9 members of the Smith family who died over 41 years from 1856 to 1897. The magnificent monument of marble features a dove sitting on a rustic cross. From Ireland, John Smith and his wife Elizabeth and children arrived in the Swan River colony in 1833. John served with the 21st Regiment of Foot and was later a barrack sergeant and bugler in the Commissariat Department who provided food and supplies. Alas, in 1862, John went over to the Mill Point in South Perth to fish or bathe, and while in the water he is supposed to have been seized with a fit and consequently died. John's son Michael went on to be a member of the Perth Building Society in 1864, chairman of the District Road Board and town councillor in 1873. Here the Anglican grave for 4 burials: Anthony Lefroy, his wife Mary, their granddaughter and Mary's father. In 1843, Anthony Lefroy arrived from from Ireland. Can't get that one mixed up. In Fremantle, aboard the ship Lady Grey. Initially, Anthony became a successful cattle farmer at Whalebing, being 160 kilometres north-east of Perth. After becoming personal secretary to Governor Fitzgerald, he then became colonial treasurer, a position which he held for 36 years. He was also chairman for the Board of Education, a colonial secretary, and on the committee of the World Club. In 1852, at St George's Cathedral in Perth, Anthony, aged 35, married Mary Bruce, aged 17. They had 5 children, including their son Sir Henry Bruce Lefroy, who lived to become the 11th Premier of Western Australia from 1917 to 1919. Here the family tree of John Daniel Manning and his wife Mary. They had 4 children, all born in England, and at least 19 grandchildren. 10 years after their marriage in England, in 1852, John and Mary and their children arrived in Fremantle on the ship called Willwatch. The first Manning property was on the site now occupied by the Mount Hospital complex at the foot of Mount Eliza. The Mannings grew vegetables and a wide range of fruits. By the 1870s, they had dairy cattle grazing on the heights of Kings Park. With the loss of free grazing at the top of the escarpment, in the 1890s, second generation John Daniel Manning Jr. purchased land on the South Perth foreshore and moved the family to a house called Southbourne. There the Manning dairy farm continued with the third family generation and became the largest South Perth dairy, which supplied milk to the whole of the Perth region. In 1895, John Daniel Manning Sr. died aged 80 and is buried with his wife Mary and their daughter-in-law in the congregational section. Here Anglican grave 459 for Captain Harrison Douglas, who died in 1852, aged only 34 years old. The reason for sharing this record with you is the curious circumstances of his death. Being a sea captain, it's understandable that the cause of his death has been recorded as drowned. Somewhat initially amusing was the fact that in the East Perth Cemetery's records, his place of death is noted as Bar at Fremantle. I clarified from an 1852 article in the Inquirer that the so-called bar was not a pub, but a sandbar on the coast at Fremantle, which a boat attempted to cross with 6 on board, including Captain Douglas from the ship called Louisa. According to the article about the fatal accident, the surf was high, the boat was swamped, and Captain Douglas was the only one of the 6 to lose his life. Sadly, the article concluded saying he left a wife and 4 children to deplore his loss. Here Anglican grave for 3 burials: George Leake, his first son John, who died aged 13, and his third son George Arthur Leake, died 1915, aged 28, who as lieutenant with the 10th Light Horse AIF, was killed in action at Gallipoli. George Leake Sr. was born 1856 into a prominent local family in Perth. He was educated at Hale School in Perth and St Peter's in Adelaide. After studying law, he was called to the bar in 1880. In 1881, George married Louisa Emily Burt, daughter of the former Chief Justice Sir Archibald Burt. They had 6 children. In 1883, aged 27, he was appointed Crown Solicitor and Public Prosecutor. George first entered Parliament in 1886, serving in the Legislative Council and Legislative Assembly for the seats of Roebourne, Albany and West Perth. George Leake served as the 3rd Premier of Western Australia, from 1901 to his premature death from pneumonia in 1902, aged only 45. Here in the Anglican section, the grave for 7 members of the Snook and Wigglesworth families. In 1857, William and Sarah Snook arrived in Fremantle aboard the Travancore. William became Sergeant of Police in Albany, later moving to Perth where he became an inspector. The grave features a magnificent monument of marble on a pedestal with inscriptions for the family members and topped by a wreath, an angel distributing blossoms. Thankfully, this impressive monument has survived the years of scavenging and vandalism at the East Perth cemeteries. In their book, Richardson and Davies documented an impressive wide variety of monument types and designs at the East Perth cemeteries. 77% of all monuments were in marble, which together with other materials such as granite and slate were imported from Europe and Britain. A small proportion of gravestones included local materials such as limestone or Donnybrook sandstone. Here the Anglican grave for Sir Archibald Paul Burt, his wife Louisa and one of their 12 children. In 1836, Archibald and Louisa married in St Kitts, West Indies. With a career as a reputable young lawyer, in 1861 Archibald, aged 51, and his family arrived in Fremantle aboard the ship Hastings. Burt was appointed as the Colony of Western Australia's inaugural Chief Justice, a position which he held until his death. In 1873, Archibald Burt, QC, was knighted by Queen Victoria for his services to the law and to Western Australia. Archibald's seventh son, Septimus, became Attorney General of WA, while their daughter Louisa, as we have heard, married George Leake, who became the state's third Premier. Septimus's grandson, Sir Francis Theodore Page Burt, served as the 11th Chief Justice of WA from 1977 to 1988 and the 27th Governor of WA from 1990 to 1993. In Perth, the Francis Burt Chambers at Allendale Square and the Francis Burt Law Education Centre and Museum in Stirling Gardens are both named in his honour. Here, Roman Catholic grave and magnificent monument for Patrick Kelly, who died 1898, aged 63. Patrick Kelly came from Ireland. His arrival date in WA is unknown. In 1862, aged 27, he married Alice Ryan. They had 5 children. During his life, Patrick served with the police department for 42 years, with postings as Sergeant of Police in Albany, Sergeant of Police in Champion Bay, and from 1878 to 1898 he was Chief Clerk and Accountant for the Police Department in Perth. Pallbearers at Patrick's funeral in 1898 included the Commissioner of Police and the Auditor General. Here, 2 Anglican graves for 25 members of the Chipper family. John Chipper and his new bride Mary ventured from England on the ship Caroline, landing in Fremantle in 1829. They had 8 children. Initially, John was a contracted labourer working as a carpenter. In 1832, while travelling from Guildford to York, he was lucky to leap off boulders and escape an attack from Aborigines. Today, a commemorative plaque can be found on the site along the Great Eastern Highway in Greenmount, now known as Chipper's Leap. John is recorded as the first paid police constable in Perth. He also held the post of bailiff of the Supreme Court for 25 years. Son Stephen was the first Chipper to venture into the business of undertaking, starting in 1861, which developed into today's Purslow and Chipper Funerals, which operates across 9 areas, mainly around Perth. Here, Anglican grave for John Bowrer and his wife Anne. John was a private with the 96th Regiment who in 1847 arrived in Fremantle on the ship Java. In 1849, aged 26, he left the regiment and married Anne Eliza Rewell, aged 20. They had at least 10 children. John worked as a horologist, repairing timekeeping devices, and in the 1870s was appointed government clockmaker. John and Anne had a son, William Charles Bowrer, who in 1888, as a wheelwright, came together with Michael O'Day, a blacksmith, to form Bowrer and O'Day, being coach builders and undertakers. Today, Bowrer and O'Day, like Purslow and Chipper, have 9 funeral home locations across Perth. For the surviving cemeteries east of Plain Street, here a headstone location guide which today is lent to visitors so they can more easily find specific numbered graves. The green and blue coloured coding denotes a convicts and guards trail, where stories can be found about convicts transported to WA, pensioner guards and officers in charge. From 1850 to 1868, 9,721 convicts were transported from Britain to WA on 43 convict ship voyages. The convicts were used in many construction projects such as Perth Town Hall, the Perth Jail, Pensioner Barracks, the Causeway Bridge, the Canning Bridge, North Fremantle Bridge, Fremantle Prison, Fremantle Lunatic Asylum, now the Fremantle Arts Centre, and paving numerous roads with Jarrah blocks. It is not known how many convicts are buried in the East Perth cemeteries. They were convicted in Britain for lengthy sentences, often 6 to 10 years, for relatively minor offences such as stealing. We'll now visit a few of their graves. Wesleyan Grave 248 is for John McCann, his wife and son. In 1857, John McCann, aged 22, received a 6-year conviction for housebreaking and stealing a shirt, a sheet, a handkerchief, boots and shoes. In 1858, with 279 other convicts, John arrived in Fremantle on the ship Edward and Fox. In 1862, at the Catholic Church in Fremantle, John, aged 27, married Mary Ann Keane, aged 25. They had 7 children. In 1863, John was given his certificate of freedom. He then worked in mines up north, including as a quarryman in the Geraldton district. Upon his early death in 1880, it is said that because the priest was unable to hear his last confession, the priest refused to bury him in consecrated ground in the Roman Catholic section. His wife Mary is supposed to have said that there was no way he would be buried in unconsecrated ground, and she would have the Methodist minister bury him. Going further, she took the children away from the convent school and brought them all up Methodist. Interesting to discover that John and Mary's great-grandson is Colin Barnett, WA's 29th Premier from 2008 to 2017. Wesleyan Grave 66 is for Enoch Barrett, his wife Mary, their son and grandson. In 1851, Enoch Barrett, aged 39, was convicted of stealing various items from his employer and sentenced to 10 years transportation. Departing from Plymouth aboard the ship William Jardine, he was one of 212 convicts who arrived at the Swan River colony in 1852. In 1858, Enoch received a full pardon. In 1860, he established the Wellington Nursery at his Murray Street residence. Today's Shafto Lane was once named Barrett Lane after the family. In 1868, he successfully applied for the position of government gardener to tend government gardens, and by the late 1870s, he'd been promoted to head gardener of the public garden and public reserves in Perth, now known as Stirling Gardens. Enoch died 1893, aged 83. Wesleyan Grave 73 is for John Summers, his parents and sister. In 1856, John, aged 19, was sentenced to 6 years penal servitude for having a jemmy with the intent of breaking into the shop of Henry Terry. John boarded the ship Lord Raglan, which left Portsmouth, England, arriving in Fremantle in 1858. Aboard the ship were 268 convicts and 84 passengers. In 1863, John gained his certificate of freedom. By 1882, John was employing more than 40 hands as wheelwrights, coach builders, upholsterers, saddlers and harness makers, along with monument cutters and inscribers. He was also the city undertaker, accredited with building Perth's first funeral hearse. Evidently, it was a lucrative business. In 1874, he was appointed to the Board of Education. In 1879, he was appointed Treasurer of City Council and Councillor of the West Ward. In 1881, Summers erected the first hansom cab stand in WA in Hay Street. In 1883, John built the first omnibus, which ran to all parts of the city. John died 1885, aged 49, from a suspected heart attack. Hear the fascinating story of Thomas Brown, who as a young man in London undertook training as an architect and civil engineer. In 1862, aged 44, he was convicted of forging money orders and ended up serving a 10-year sentence in WA. As a free man, in 1877, Brown became an advocate for the rail route from Fremantle to Guildford along the southern side of the Swan River. However, he was personally attacked for his former status as a convict, and the northern route won the day. It didn't help that he was nicknamed as Satan Brown for his black hair, sallow complexion and saturnine or gloomy temperament. In 1880, Brown redeveloped the disused mill in South Perth, turning it into a hotel and picnic grounds called the Altar Gardens. The old mill was transformed with a ground floor bar, a second floor with a smoking room and a snuggery, and a viewing platform of the Swan River. With financial troubles, the venture only lasted about a year. In 1882, Thomas Brown, aged 63, was found guilty of criminal activities over a land transaction. In prison that night, waiting to be sentenced, he committed suicide by taking strychnine. Initially, he was buried in the East Perth Cemetery's Presbyterian section, but later he was moved to the Felon section, an area west of Plain Street that has now been bulldozed and developed into housing. Anglican grave 756 is for John Rowland Jones. In 1866, John, aged 27, was convicted in North Wales for embezzlement and forgery of an order for the payment of money and was sentenced to 8 years' transportation to Australia. In 1868, he was one of 269 convicts to arrive in Fremantle aboard the ship Hougoumont, being the last convict ship to Australia. In 1874, John received his Certificate of Freedom. By the 1880s, John was editor of the Western Australian Times. For 2 years, he was a Hansard reporter. In about 1886, John and his wife Elizabeth built one of the first private houses in Subiaco. Given it was built in an isolated area, it was called Jones's Folly. In those days, keeping up with the Joneses had little appeal. John died in 1895, aged 57, from heart disease. The enrolled pensioner force, popularly known as the Pensioner Guards, were British military personnel who served on the convict transportation ships to WA and were given employment and grants of land on arrival. More than 1,100 arrived in WA between 1850 and 1868, in many cases with their families. To house the pensioner guards and their families, convicts were set to work from 1863 to 1866 to build the pensioner guard barracks at the head of St George's Terrace. The barracks contained 120 rooms, a hospital, magazine and other facilities. From 1900, the barracks were converted to offices for the Public Works Department. In 1966, most of the barracks building was demolished to make way for the Mitchell Freeway. Today, all that remains is the well-known Barracks Arch. On the slide are 6 of the many pensioner guards buried at East Perth Cemeteries, including, as pictured, Corporal John Flynn, who served for 12 years with the 3rd and 49th Regiments, including fighting in Crimea. In 1862, John, aged 38, arrived in Fremantle on the ship Norwood. Later, he was granted land used as a dairy farm in Northbridge. He died 1877, aged 52. Here the known grave of another pensioner guard, George Throssell, and his wife Jane Ann. George joined the 17th Dragoons Lancers, where he served for over 8 years. After being injured by a horse falling on him, he was discharged as a corporal in 1836. George, as an enrolled pensioner guard in charge of convicts, with his wife Jane and 3 children, arrived in Fremantle aboard the Scindian in 1850. Aboard the ship were 75 male convicts and 200 passengers, including 163 who were pensioner guards and their families. In Perth, Michael became a sergeant of police, then a police inspector. George and Jane's son, George Throssell Jr., became the second Premier of Western Australia for a 3-month period in 1901. His son was Captain Hugo Throssell, the first Western Australian and only Australian light horseman to receive the Victoria Cross for his actions at Gallipoli in 1915. Anglican grave 368 is for Richard Roach Jewell, his wife Eliza and 3 of their 9 children. In 1852, Richard Jewell, with his wife and family, arrived in Fremantle on the ship Willwatch. Having been a carpenter and builder in England, he was initially employed as assistant with the convict establishment in Fremantle. Richard became a very prominent architect and was superintendent of public works for 31 years, from 1853 to 1884. His legacy included designing the Perth Town Hall, the Perth Jail, the Wesley Church, the Public Trust Office, the Treasury, Perth Cloisters, the Pensioner Barracks, Wesley Church, Holy Trinity Church at York, the York Courthouse and 2J Jail. Richard was a member of the Perth City Council and Deputy Commissioner of Railways. He retired aged 75 and died aged 81. Anglican grave 511 is for the burial of 4 men. In 1864, 3 men, William Goldwire, James Harding and Frederick Panter, were said to have been murdered by Aboriginal natives on the northwest coast of WA in the vicinity of Roebuck Bay. Their bodies were returned to Perth, where thousands of spectators attended their public funeral. The 4th person in the grave is Maitland Brown, who led a search party that discovered the 3 bodies. When Maitland Brown died in 1905, aged 61, his body was initially buried at Karrakatta, but was later exhumed and buried along with his friends in East Perth in 1911. In February 1913, a monument to Brown and the 3 killed men, called the Explorers Monument, was unveiled in the Esplanade Park in Fremantle. Here, Anglican grave of Tommy Dower, with a notable tribute on the headstone which says, "In memory of Aboriginal native Tommy Dower, died July 2, 1895, aged 50 years. He was possessed of more than ordinary intelligence and ability. He accompanied Alexander Forrest on his exploration from the De Grey River to Port Darwin, 1879, when the Kimberley district was discovered. He also accompanied Sir John Forrest on several surveying expeditions in various parts of the colony. This stone was erected by the Aborigines Protection Board in recognition of his services to the colony." The slide shows a couple of photos, firstly with Tommy and the 1879 Forest expedition members, and secondly as a leading figure of the Coburn Aboriginal groups in 1894. This one's a bit hard to see. Apologies. This table shows the arrivals and descendants for 10 couples, being some of the early settlers who made a significant contribution to the development of the early Swan River colony, being the families of Douglas, Hardy, Manning, Munger, Pabry, Rowe, Shenton, Tondet and Trigg. Listed are the 12 ships on which they arrived, being a fraction of the 300 passenger ships which voyaged to Fremantle in a 60-year period between 1829 and 1889. Of the 10 couples, they had 89 children, who with 59 wives and husbands brought forth at least 294 grandchildren. All of the 10 couples lived until at least the age of 50, with 9 people reaching age 80 and 1 reaching age 90, being Henry Trigg. At least 78 from these families have graves in the East Perth cemeteries. Of the 78, there was a minimum of 28 different causes of death that I've noted in the various age groups. Of the 78, almost 1/3 died before the age of 10. Thankfully, since then, medical advances have greatly reduced that high death rate. I thought it worth mentioning that within the WA Genealogical Society, there is a special interest group called Swan River Pioneers 1829 to 1838, who honour the memory of the early settlers for their enduring hardships and difficulties in the early years of the Swan River colony. Their aims include preserving the early history and completing genealogical data of the pioneers and their families to assist people in connecting branches of their own family trees. At events during the year, certificates of descendancy and a badge are given to those who can prove their direct line of descent from the early pioneers arriving in the Swan River colony between 1829 and 1838, being the period of Sir James Stirling's administration. For more information, refer to their website. Now the slide perhaps you've all been waiting for, ghosts. Some might be wondering whether there are ghosts. Hear a story from 1920 where Mr. David Lord was chained alone to a bed for a night at the East Perth Cemeteries. It was done to promote a movie at the Theatre Royal called The Greatest Question, about whether ghosts were real. Similar promotional stunts occurred around Australia. Mr. Lord survived a so-called night of terror, telling the tale of hearing footsteps, but says it could have been the sound of falling pine cones. He also saw a woman in a white gown and later a shrouded man at the foot of the bed that he was chained to, but admits both could have been his overactive imagination on a moonlit night. Not in doubt was the impact of the story on increasing attendance at the movie. As to more recent times, I'm reliably told that from time to time there are inexplicable movements of items in St Bartholomew's Church. At least twice, the CPU in the locked cupboard was found upside down, and books have been moved. A camera was installed, but this mysteriously fell off a shelf and broke. These incidents have been attributed to elusive ethereal ghosts at play, but then again there may be other more logical reasons. The stories tonight are based on what I have read and are only a small fraction of the many stories which can be found at the East Perth Cemeteries. The various sources of information have not always been consistent, including numerous instances where dates are in contention. Records such as the online website for the East Perth Cemeteries are sometimes incomplete and should be checked where possible to source documents. Whilst I've tried to give some of the highlights, I suggest referring to other information on many of these early settlers who led very full lives. I hope you've enjoyed this evening's seated tour of 30 graves. If you are interested in visiting the East Perth Cemeteries for a modest fee, you can visit on Sundays from 2 to 4 p.m. Or you might like to take a guided 2-hour tour with 2 feet and a heartbeat. For those interested, I have a few walking trail maps. I think I've got 5. So for those who are keen, this is my own design and a walk which I did a month or two ago with 10 friends. So we covered pretty much all the graves which I've been talking about this evening. For those who are really keen, I think there are 5 here, so you're welcome to take them. So that's the end of the talk. I'd like to acknowledge the volunteers who work at the East Perth Cemetery. Val, how many years have you been a volunteer there, Val? 30 years. So a lot of experience. And Leslie and Stephanie. So Leslie's in charge of the volunteers, so you're welcome to have a chat with them. I'm sure they'd be... And I'd like to acknowledge some of the members of the Munger family. So Gary Munger, who's come up from Rockingham over here, and Diane. Where are you, Diane? Oh, at the back there. So Diane contacted the Maylands Historical Society during the week and kindly alerted me to the fact that her paternal grandmother is a Munger, and your great-great-grandfather was Stephen Munger, who was brother to John Henry Munger. So I thought I would. I shared this story with Gary before. So I had mentioned in the talk that John Henry Munger built the Faversham House in York. I should have perhaps included there were just so many stories to include, but I thought I'd include this one at the end because it's quite funny, I thought. So that John Henry Munger Sr. had a son, John Henry Munger Jr., who took over the Faversham House, and he had a younger brother called Joseph. And Joseph, just to irritate his brother, built another Faversham House across directly opposite where the first Faversham House was. But apparently that got destroyed in the Meckering earthquake, and there's very little left of it these days. Anyway, so it's quite an amusing the story. And when I another little anecdote, which I thought I'd mention, which when I joined my friends a month or so ago, Leslie kindly organised for some of the volunteers there to talk to us, and one of them mentioned about the I mentioned that there was a felon section before, and our friend Satan Brown ended up in the dug up from the Presbyterian section, ended up in the felon section. But I was told by one of the, I was reminded by one of the volunteers that there were a lot of people who were hung here in Perth. So I actually researched it this afternoon, and between 1833 to 1887, so a period of 54 years, there were 66 people who were hung either in the Perth jail or in the Perth area and Victoria Park. So all of them were men, except for Margaret Cody in 1871. And I believe down at Fremantle Prison between 1888 and 1984, there were 43 men and one woman who were hung down there. So I'm sure a lot of them ended up in the felon section at the East Perth Cemeteries, but unfortunately a lot of those records have disappeared. So I'll hand it to the floor now, and anybody who would like to make some comments, I welcome those.
You mentioned Jews and Chinese.
Yes.
Were there any other ethnic groups as well?
Not specifically. They were just the 8 groups that I mentioned. So if there were other ethnic groups, I guess they got admitted as being a Roman Catholic or a Wesleyans, but they weren't sort of designated specifically. There aren't any specific areas that I know of for particular ethnicities within the cemeteries.
I'd like to say something.
Yes.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, what's your name?
My name's Joyce.
Oh, yes.
Hi, and I have 2 cousins here tonight, and we represent the Lawrence family. And the Lawrence family William Lawrence was the first member of the family to come to WA, completely in a different trajectory from any of the people that you have described tonight. He was an American whaler. He deserted his ship in Albany. He came in 1842 on a ship called Florida.
Uh-huh.
He became a shipbuilder, quite a renowned shipbuilder in Perth. And his legacy, apart from all of us, is a lot of very good old wooden ships and steamships roaming around right now, like the Lady Lord, for instance, the Duchess,
the famous Duchess.
Yes, yes.
Ah.
So, yes, he had a very different, he was colourful. And
I think there were a lot of colourful characters in those days.
So, he got transported from the family house in Mill Street all the way to East Perth Cemetery under an American flag, which was loaned from the American consul at the time and had to be returned.
Uh-huh.
He apparently was very, very interested in gold and financed the first gold-paying trip to the Yilgarn. And he also went on expeditions up north. So, a very different background, but still contributing to, the fabric of WA history, I suppose
Yes.
you could say.
Thank you for sharing that story.
Goldwire, where our mother...
Oh, would you like to... your names are...
Yvonne, Maureen.
Yvonne and Maureen, yes?
Yeah. You talked about the Goldwire, Harding and
Maitland Brown was one. James Harding.
Yes.
Yes.
So that's our mother's, our great grandfather.
Oh, goodness. Wow.
Goldwire.
Because I've been walking past that
It's quite a
that monument down in Fremantle, and I'd really never noticed the significance of it.
Once she said, "Oh, let's go walk past here," but she didn't mention she was only after her death and we did some research.
It's a very prominent feature in the East Perth cemeteries.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, it's quite an impressive thing.
Yeah.
And we were told, I don't know how true it was, the volunteers would probably know more than us, that the church was consecrated because of them being moved there and they wanted to do the big funeral.
Wow. I'm sure there must be some other stories there. Please feel free to share. Yes.
I'd like to know from the volunteers if there was a way of finding the specific location of a grave in East Perth Cemetery, because my great-grandfather was buried there and I only know approximately the location.
Well, perhaps I can answer that. If you go onto the East Perth Cemetery's website, it's very good, and you can enter in a surname, and it'll come up with all the surnames that match that. And if you've got a first name, it'll help, and it'll show.
It's not the full name, but and I know he's in the congregational area at the end, the northern end,
But
the corner of Whitman Street.
but if you open up that record, there is actually a map on the record that will show you where that location is, and it's quite a good indication. But the map that I showed you before, and you might like one of these, if you've got very good eyesight, this map actually has the number of the graves on it, and you can use that as well.
The second grave is nearby to his daughter, who was only 6 months old, who died 6 months before him, and by the sound of what you said, she's probably originally retired for it.
Right. I think you'll find it's fairly easy to find, because they've done a lot of work on it, but as I've mentioned in my closing comments, as I have found, there are inaccuracies in the records for whatever reason. I mean, they did the best that they could, but generally speaking, it's very good.
I think I've been able to ascertain from what there is their location within 5 metres or so, or 10 metres, but I'd be interested to know specifically where they are.
Right.
There's very little marking. When I last went west, there was very little where to mark to show where the rows of graves were or where they started and finished.
Also, you got to the vicinity, but you couldn't find it exactly.
No.
Oh, perhaps a bit more hunting around.
If it's unmarked.
Unless it's marked as a specific grave number, you won't find it.
No.
Yes.
I think we have a grave number, but I had to guess where it was because there's nothing there to show.
Have you asked St Anthony?
No.
You know who St Anthony is?
No, I realise there's a team.
He's the patron saint of finding things. My aunt always used to ask St Anthony if she'd lost her car keys or something. It was remarkable how many things he found for her.
He's one of the ghosts.
Anyone else? Yes. Sorry.
What is the future of the East Perth Cemetery? Is it going to be able to stay the way it is, or is development going to take over?
I think the only development that I'm aware of is on the on the western side, where they're going to be building these towers, apparently. And they've cleared all that, and they exhumed the 461 individuals and put them in the ossuary containers in the memorial garden in the Karrakatta Cemetery. And that's, if you can visit over there at the Karrakatta, it's really worthwhile to go and have a look. It's quite interesting. But I did hear a story that at one stage, a long time ago, they were thinking of redeveloping the existing 12.5 acres, but thankfully that never went ahead. And I would imagine there'd be a huge outcry if anyone attempted to do anything like that these days. I don't think that would ever happen. Anyone else?
Greg will be here for a little while we clear up and afterwards, but in the meantime, thank you very much indeed, Greg.